But anyway, I'll send it now. So tonight, what we're going over will be lectures 12 and 13. So algae and plants, essentially. And I kind of realized today that you have a midterm, not even a midterm, I guess, but a final coming up next week, or kind of like a half final. It's sort of interesting the way they've decided to split this up. I think it'll be a good thing. I think it'll be good because it might be a little bit more stress kind of this week, next week. But then at the end of the semester, you only have to study for the second half of the course for your final. So I think it's a pretty sick deal. That being said, I've been finding lately it's a very stressful time of year. I think it always gets a little bit stressful. Kind of the leading weeks, getting up to reading week. So don't forget to kind of take care of yourself, get some rest, eat well, try to get outside when the days are not freezing cold. It's almost reading week, just keep that in mind. Anyway, so that's just tonight's little pick-me-up, I guess. But anyway, sort of getting into things here. As always, if there are any questions, feel free to let me know. Also, I want to acknowledge my background. I can turn it off if it's a distraction for anyone. I just had it set to this for a study group I was in yesterday, and I didn't change it back just because it's a little fun. But if it's distracting in any way, let me know. I can change it back. Okay, so with that, starting with algae. Also, I don't know if this is a grammatically correct question. What are algae? I think I had it as what is algae, and Word told me that was not correct. So anyway, doesn't really matter. Basically, what are the characteristics of algae? There are kind of a few different characteristics that define algae. Starting kind of with the most basic, algae are eukaryotic. And they're also photosynthetic. Those are two really, really important points when it comes to algae. In terms of photosynthesis, algae is responsible for, I think, about, like 50% of, oh, what's the word I'm looking for? It was in lecture. It's like, I'm just drawing a blank. Anyway, 50% of productivity in terms of photosynthesis globally. That's the word I was looking for, productivity. So yeah, they really do a lot of photosynthesis. They're very efficient with photosynthesis, and there's a lot of algae on the globe, so a lot of photosynthesis gets done. They're also aquatic, which is fairly intuitive. Not necessarily, I guess, but I think most people have, depending on where you're from, I guess, but at least kind of Canada, Atlantic Canada for sure. You've probably wandered out into the woods and seen a pond with some scummy looking stuff on the surface, being algae. So algae's aquatic. And we'll get into that actually. I'll save that for later. Algae can be unicellular or it can be multicellular. So that's not really something you can, I guess, define algae based off of because it can exist as either. One very important point to algae that kind of differentiates algae from aquatic plants, which is what I said we were going to get into later, which will come up again. Algae lack roots and shoots differentiation. So algae don't have roots or leaves, essentially. So they're not, they're just not quite as differentiated as what we know as plants are. And like I said, we'll talk about that a bit more later this evening. Okay. What are the closest relative to plants and what features do they share with plants? So closest relatives to plants are a type of algae, but specifically charophytes. They are a type of green algae. So if you're looking at like a tree of life of, kind of comparing plants to different types of algae, charophytes and land plants are really closely linked together. And we talked about 3 features that they share. They aren't necessarily the only ones. They're kind of ones that we mentioned that we thought, or not we, I guess, but they were brought up in lecture. They were deemed kind of important. I probably wouldn't worry too much about completely understanding and knowing all of the ins and outs of these 3 traits. Just kind of being aware that these are 3 things that charophytes and land plants have in common. So the first, although again, I don't think they're in any particular order, but both charophytes and land plants have rings of cellulose synthesizing proteins. So we know cellulose to be, why did I do that? We know cellulose to be strongly associated with plants. Cotton, for example, is like 99% cellulose. Not all cotton, but it's usually, roughly in the 90s, upwards of like 99% cellulose. So that makes sense that charophytes, which are really closely related to plants, are also able to produce these proteins that synthesize cellulose. They also both have a similar structure of flagellated sperm, which we'll also talk about a bit more kind of when we get into that kind of moving, I guess, the adaptations that allowed for plants to go from being aquatic to, having land plants. The third one is phragmoplast formation, which is a big word. It's a bit intimidating because it's a little bit out of left field, I guess. But essentially, it involves the cell plate in mitosis. So fuels organize production of the cell plate in a dividing cell. Basically what that means is the cell plate is the structure that, this is probably getting too far into even details that you would want to be worried about, but essentially in plants and also charophytes, when mitosis is going down, there's kind of this cell plate structure that forms along the midline of the cell. So during, metaphase, when they all line up in the middle of the cell, all the chromosomes, you get this cell plate formation. And typically that's associated with plants because it doesn't happen in animal cells, but it does happen in charophyte cells as well. So they're not a plant, but they're closely related to plants. And so we see this cell plate formation in charophytes as well. So again, I wouldn't probably be too worried about like, oh, I need to know exactly all the ins and outs of what these 3 things mean. Just kind of being able to recognize those are similarities between plants and charophytes, their most closely related relative. Okay. Next thing, I kind of briefly mentioned that we would get to this. Some of the challenges of moving to land and basically how these challenges were overcome. So on an evolutionary scale, we didn't just all of a sudden have plants on land. A lot of things came from water. So life existed in water before it existed on land, and that includes plants. So you can imagine years and years and years ago when plants were starting to, move to land, and there were a few challenges that they had to overcome and some adaptations that they had to evolve in order to kind of persevere under these challenges. So again, there's no particular order. I think I'm probably going to I'll probably list them all first and then talk about how these challenges were overcome. So the first challenge, again, no particular order really, but gravity was a challenge. Because if you think about, I don't know if this is like a thing everyone can relate to, or if I was just that kid that liked to play in ponds and streams a lot when I was younger. But so maybe this isn't a universal experience, but if you imagine, you know, kind of you have like a fistful of grass or just weeds that like are growing within a pond, and you can, I don't know, I feel like everyone has this grasp of like seaweed, you know, and it just kind of like floats. I don't know. I don't really know where I'm going with this description. But anyway, so imagine seaweed growing on the bottom of, you know, whatever. It doesn't have to be the sea, ocean, lake, pond, stream, whatever. And it kind of just floats nicely. But if you were to kind of rip it out from the bottom of the body of water that it was in, bring it onto land, it would kind of like flop over. Because gravity is not of concern in the water. But when plants were first moving onto land, gravity was an issue. And they needed to develop an adaptation that would allow them to kind of stand on their own without the support of water. Okay. The next one was the issue of, how do you spell desiccation? Okay, oh, that's kind of embarrassing. Anyway, desiccation was the next one, which is essentially a fancy word for drying out, dehydrating. So as you can imagine, plants that previously existed entirely in water would never have to worry about desiccation because they were constantly surrounded by water. There was no shortage of water when the plants are literally in a lake, for example. But when those same plants are starting to evolve to survive on land, getting water is a bit more of an issue because depending on the terrain, that can be dependent on, you know, how much moisture is in the soil or the air. Now I'm getting ahead of myself. But essentially, yeah, a lot less water on land than there is in water. So plants are at more of a risk of drying themselves out. We'll get back to that, talk about how that was overcome as well. Okay, so the next one, the challenge of dispersal. So essentially, like referring to dispersal of gametes. If you think about a dandelion, for example, that's just the easiest one, even though, you know, that's, you think about like a dandelion seed kind of floating along the wind. That's a seed, that's not a gamete. So it's a little bit different, but essentially the same concept. So basically, plants in water had the ability for their gametes to just float through water. Whereas plants on land, obviously air and water have different viscosities. So that was a challenge initially as well, was basically how are we going to disperse our gametes in this different medium that we're not used to. Okay, the next kind of challenge, again, they're not in really any order, but I've said that a bunch. But the next one that I'm going to talk about is that there was abundant light, which isn't the problem. Light is a good thing. They were definitely getting more light than they would have when they were living on land, or living in water, sorry. But there was competition for this light. So a lot of plants moving to land at the same time. There's going to be a lot of plants that are looking to use that sunlight that's coming down, and we'll get to that as well. Okay, and then the next challenge is actually caused by one of these adaptations, so I will get back to that at the end. Don't let me forget about it. Okay. So getting to kind of how these challenges were overcome. So getting back to, I'm just worried that I might have not done this in the most logical flow, but that's all right. Getting back to gravity. So we said the plants, you know, not used to being in this medium of air, very much used to being surrounded by water. So gravity was an issue. And the adaptation that helped to overcome the challenge of gravity was the development of lignin for support and structure. So lignin is a molecule that's really common in land plants. And essentially, it provides support and structure. So it allowed the plants to kind of strengthen up, I guess. That's not necessarily kind of the best wording. But it allowed them to kind of be solid enough that they could withstand the forces of gravity without being in water. Okay, back to desiccation. So basically, they faced the challenge of potentially drying out because previously they'd been surrounded by water. That was not an issue whatsoever. But now being on land where, you know, absorption occurs, or not absorption, that's kind of the wrong word. But I mean, think about if you have in like the summer, for example, if maybe you're at a pool, you're outside, or you're swimming in a lake or whatever, and you dry off with a towel, and then the towel's wet, you hang the towel up to dry, and you know, if it's a hot sunny day, it's not too humid, the towel can be dry in like 20 minutes. So all of the water that's within that towel has been sucked out into the atmosphere. So essentially that could happen with plants. All the water within the plant gets sucked out. That's, you know, why droughts impact agriculture and that sort of thing. That's not any revolutionary news, probably. But plants had to kind of evolve some sort of adaptation to lessen this effect. And the adaptation that was developed was waxy surfaces. So on their leaves, mostly, stem, I guess, as well. But okay, I have a plant sitting here that I was about to like grab and show you, but I'm sure you can all imagine, you've all seen a leaf before probably. It's kind of got that glossy, waxy look to it. And essentially the purpose that that serves is that it kind of blocks pores so that water can't just be eliminated through those pores 24/7. The waxy outer surface kind of inhibits water from leaving the plant's surfaces. So it doesn't really help with getting the plant more water, but it helps with retaining the water that the plant has already obtained from its roots, for example. Okay. So dispersal, essentially, it's hard to really kind of talk about how this challenge was overcome because it really depends kind of on a plant for plant basis, because not all plants disperse their gametes in a similar fashion. But essentially, there were adaptations for gametes and spores. Oops. So yeah, that's a little bit vague, but that's all right. Basically, you can just think of it as, you know, adaptations kind of occurred on a as needed basis, I guess. So not all of the adaptations were the same for every plant. Okay, so for the issue of having abundant light, but there being competition, is pretty straightforward, makes sense. Height is basically how they overcame this. So now that these plants had lignin, which would help with support and structure, it allowed them to grow much taller. And as you can imagine, if you think about being in a forest full of big tall trees and sort of intermediate trees and then low level shrubbery, the big tall trees are going to get the most sunlight, and then they're going to block out sunlight from the other trees within the forest and the other scrubs and bushes and that sort of thing. So yeah, height was important. basically, if you could grow taller than the rest of the plants, you could get more sunlight than the rest of the plants. Yeah, and again, that was made possible by the development of lignin for support and structure. And height was also previously kind of an issue because the bigger the plant gets, the further the resources have to stretch. So if you think of like a huge like redwood tree out on the West Coast, or even just like a spruce tree in New Brunswick, if you're in New Brunswick, you might not be. Those get pretty big too, not redwood size, obviously, but trying to get water from the roots of a big spruce tree up to the top, quite a challenge, right? But with these developments, there was also the development of vascular tissue, which we'll elaborate on in a bit. So yeah, with vascular, tissue to move resources. So yeah, basically some system had to be developed to get water from the roots all the way up to the tippy top of a 30-foot tall tree. Or even, you know, could be applicable to smaller plants as well, for sure. Okay, so the final challenge, which I said was actually caused by one of these, it's caused by the solution to desiccation. So these waxy surfaces were really good at keeping water in the plant, but the issue arose because, come on, of CO2 absorption. So we're on land, in air, CO2 is abundant, particularly back when plants were first evolving to live on land. The climate was very different from what it is now, although we're definitely doing a great job at getting that CO2 concentration back up. Unfortunately, I say that like it's a good thing, it's not. But anyway, so it was a very CO2 rich environment. So CO2 was very abundant, more abundant than it had been in an aquatic situation. But the waxy surfaces, that were developed to kind of keep water in were also impeding absorption of CO2, which is not a good thing because we know plants require carbon dioxide. So essentially what occurred was plants developed pores for gas exchange. So basically little microscopic holes that allow for CO2 to kind of, CO2, O2, to flow in and out of plant surfaces. Okay. That's all I got for that. Let me know if you have any questions. I feel like I'm like, no, I'm moving at a good pace, I think. If I'm not, let me know. Okay. Sorry, my water bottle's a bit shrill at times. I feel like headphone users need a warning when I'm gonna twist it open. It's quite loud. Okay, so what developments led to the origin of seedless vascular plants? What is the significance of vascular seedless plants? I don't know why I switched the wording around to seedless vascular and then vascular seedless, same thing. I don't know why I did that. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what order you put them in. But anyway, so what developments led to the origin of seedless vascular plants? So we said, you know, these plants coming out of the water, initially, they probably didn't all have this vascular tissue adaptation. And that's why we have non-vascular land plants that exist. Like mosses, ferns, that sort of thing. But then some plants, as you know, with this urge to grow taller and taller, developed vascular tissues to move resources. So that's the first one. Vascular tissues, or vascular plants, sorry, as the name implies, have vascular tissues. And vascular tissue in plants is really kind of synonymous with vascular tissue in animals. So our vascular system is, you know, our veins, arteries move resources around through the bloodstream. Kind of the same concept with vascular tissue in plants. There are two main types of vascular tissue in plants. Whoops. Called xylem and phloem, which are kind of fun. Whoops. Phloem, that always reminds me of phloem. I don't know if anyone out there remembers phloem. The toy that was popular in like, I don't know, 2006 maybe. It's kind of like Play-Doh. Anyway, it's a bit of a throwback, but I always think of that when I hear phloem because it's essentially sounds the exact same. But anyway, these two vascular tissues are pretty important. And kind of the differentiations between them are a bit slight. Really, they're very similar. But xylem tissue are made up of tube-shaped cells. So the cells themselves are shaped like tubes. And xylem is responsible for moving water and minerals throughout the plant. Phloem, on the other hand, this again is a really slight distinction, but phloem have cells arranged into tubes. So the cells themselves are not shaped like a tube, but they kind of like link up and kind of arrange themselves into a tube shape. But I think it's kind of cool. And phloem are largely associated with transportation of, well, organic products, but the main one is probably sugar. So sugars and other organic products. How I keep these straight in my head, which I guess, I don't know if this is really even that applicable this semester with having like open note tests. But anyway, a little memory trick that I always use to keep these two separated. This is a bit of a stretch, I will admit. So when I think about phloem, aside from thinking about the early 2000s moldable foam that I would play with, I think about sugars being transported within a tree. Almost that time of year again, I start to think about maple syrup and, you know, maple sap. Probably because my dad is obsessed with making maple syrup. But anyway, so that's kind of what I associate phloem with because it moves sugars throughout the vascular system. And so to remember that phloem moves sugars, I think of sugar being associated with maple syrup, obviously. And this is a stretch for sure, but I look at the word phloem, and if you kind of close your eyes and squint, it kind of looks a little bit like the word maple in the sense that there's an M, there's a P, there's an L, there's an E. Obviously, it's not that close to maple, but that's how I remember that phloem is associated with sugars. So then I'm like, okay, well, xylem must be associated with water and minerals. So yeah, I don't know if that's helpful or not. But anyway, that's how I keep it straight. Yeah, so those are the two main vascular tissues. Another development was the development of roots. So as I said earlier, algae don't have roots. When we were kind of getting more into plants than algae, the development of roots occurred. Roots are important for a number of reasons. Primarily, you know, a great big one is absorption. So it absorbs water from the soil, minerals from the soil. Plant roots can, this is getting a little bit too far ahead of ourselves, but plant roots can form symbiotic relationships with hyphae networks and fungi. So there's a lot going down in the soil that's quite important. Also, anchorage is a big one. So basically just holding the plant in place. Like I said, if you think of like a huge 30-foot spruce tree, you don't want that to just kind of tip over when the wind picks up. I mean, it does happen, I guess, but big trees can withstand a lot of wind typically. That's because they have these roots that are deep in the ground, holding them in, anchoring them down. Another development would be leaves, which you might be like, okay, leaves. That's so exciting. You know, we know what a leaf is, but essentially why they're important is they increase surface area, which basically anytime you see increased surface area in any biological context, I can't think of a single time that's a bad thing. Increased surface area in biology, always a good thing. Don't hold me to that. There might be like some weird examples, but for the most part, it's always a good thing. For plants, it's good for good for photosynthesis and CO2 capture. I'm not going to make my too little this time. It takes too much time. But anyway, yeah. So the leaves are bigger. The leaves are responsible for photosynthesis and intake of CO2. So the leaves being bigger allows for more photosynthesis and more CO2 capture. Pretty straightforward. Why are seedless vascular plants significant? Because evolutionarily, they kind of came along. And as I was saying earlier, with the CO2 being very abundant in the atmosphere, way back when all of this was going down, this was kind of the first time we had organisms on land that could take CO2 out of the atmosphere. So kind of mitigate that carbon dioxide and capture it from the atmosphere. So they were significant evolutionarily because they drastically reduced atmospheric CO2. And by reducing the levels of atmospheric CO2 by such amounts, they also drastically impacted the evolution of other species. Oops. Oh my goodness. So having a major reduction in CO2 in the atmosphere would definitely impact how other species evolving at the same time, or even a little bit down the road, would have evolved. So yeah, plants are cool. Save the trees. We're getting ourselves into a very spooky carbon crisis as we speak, so we need trees to mitigate that carbon dioxide, and other plants. Anyway, I'm sure you all know that, but just shows how important they are. I love plants, so. Okay. I'm a bit spacey this evening, but again, rather typical of me. Okay, so I've kind of alluded to this many times this evening, the two main differences between algae and aquatic plants. There are more than two differences. These are the two we kind of looked at in the lecture videos. So the first being, they have different evolutionary lineages. So, plot twist in the sense that aquatic plants are actually just, land plants. Oh my goodness. There we go. Common there. They're just underwater. So in an evolutionary way of thinking, aquatic plants and land plants, same thing. It's just that aquatic plants are in water and land plants are on land. But evolutionarily, they're very similar. So aquatic plants, much more closely related to land plants. They're the same than they are to algae. So algae and aquatic plants, just different evolutionary lineages. Sorry. The second point being their morphology. So we've kind of talked about this a bit already. Algae are non-vascular, so they don't have any vascular tissue to move things from, one end of the algae to the other. They're also without roots, without the roots. That's not what I meant to say, without true roots. So some algae, thinking of big like golden algae, have like a holdfast that kind of allows for anchorage to rocks and that sort of thing. But they don't have true roots like aquatic plants do. Yeah, I guess this is pretty much saying the same thing, but aquatic plants have specialized tissue such as xylem and phloem. And roots, true roots. Okay. Good. So yeah, getting kind of away from algae finally. Not finally, algae's pretty cool. But more into the plant side of thing. What are seeds and why are they advantageous? I did this, not this exact, maybe this exact question. I don't know. I did Pal last year for this course as well. I don't reuse my questions. I make my sheets up new. But I definitely remember asking this question because someone was like, I think we know what a seed is, which I thought was kind of funny because, you know, it's kind of intuitive. Everyone's like, I have some idea of what a seed is, yes. But anyway, I very much like to have straightforward definitions when I'm studying, so that I have kind of like a biological definition of things. Like I know what a seed is. It's the little brown thing in an apple, obviously. But why are they important to biology and to this course? So a seed can be defined as an embryonic plant enclosed in a protective outer covering. So that's kind of the hard part of the seed, is that protective outer covering. So it's basically a plant embryo, which is kind of cool. Which makes sense because, you know, if you're going to plant a garden, you buy seeds and you plant them and they grow into a vegetable, a fruit, whatever. So it's kind of intuitive, I guess. But yeah, why are seeds advantageous, sorry. So we just finished talking about seedless vascular plants, and then we also have vascular plants with seeds. So plants that have seeds have some evolutionary advantages over those that don't. Mainly, they have this sort of protection of their embryos. So they're, whoops. My goodness, I wish I was competent at typing. So essentially their embryos are protected from, here we go, environmental conditions. Oh my goodness, there we go. And so environmental conditions, that's a bit broad, vague, but basically anything. They're protected from drought. They're protected from flood to an extent. They're protected from a wildfire, that sort of thing. And basically they're protected until the time is right, which again is quite vague. But essentially these seed mechanisms are very, very good at determining when it's a good time to kind of start to sprout. And that's just, you know, millions of years of evolution. So for example, I can't remember, forgive me, this has happened quite a few times this semester that I'm like, I don't remember if we talked about this in bio or if this is an example that's just applicable to bio, but from one of my classes that I'm taking. Anyway, about, you know, some species of trees that have cones that are actually activated by intense heat. So when a forest fire comes through, those cones drop to the ground and they're activated by this intense heat. So essentially its parent tree might be destroyed in the wildfire, but already pretty much instantaneously, it's like, all right, let's go, let's drop this seed, get it in the ground and start growing a new tree, which I think is kind of cool. So very good at determining when the time is right, as I said. Okay, gametophyte reduction. What is gametophyte reduction? Essentially, so kind of going back to, this was like a couple weeks ago that we talked about it in class now, but it came up again. The whole concept of sporophytes, gametophytes, that sort of thing. So when we're talking about seeded vascular plants, they are sporophyte dominated. But we know that gametophytes also play a role as well. So essentially, to make it not too confusing, sporophytes are evolved to survive in conditions that gametophytes are not, particularly dry environments, unlike gametophytes. Oh my goodness, there we go. So basically, sporophytes are just evolved to survive tougher conditions that gametophytes can't last through. So basically what will happen is the number of gametophyte cells will be reduced. So instead of being dependent, oh my goodness, there was an ant on my laptop. Sorry for the jump scare. I don't know where it went. I'm a bit timid of ants. I don't know where that came from. It's February. You shouldn't be here. Oh, that scared me. Okay, it was just a little ant. I'll let him live. Anyway, really sorry about that. Okay, where was I? That frightened me. Right. So instead of depending on gametophytes, which aren't, keen on surviving in environments that are more dry, more prone to desiccation, the number of gametophyte cells within the plant will be reduced. So it could still be multicellular, of course, but plants are going to depend on sporophytes instead. And basically, this will protect from desiccation. Oh my goodness. You think I would know how to spell it by now. As well as things like UV radiation. So basically, it's just an evolutionarily derived protection method because sporophytes are just evolved to survive better, I guess, in different environments. So the number of gametophytes will be reduced, gametophyte reduction, and sporophytes will dominate instead. Okay, again, sorry for the ant distraction. I hope that was at least made a little bit of sense, even amidst my panic. I think that was all I wanted to say, but I could be missing something due to distraction. So if you have any questions, let me know. Anyway, because I think, yeah, we're making good time. Because these are the only 2 questions left. So what are the defining characteristics of gymnosperms? So gymnosperms are a variety of vascular seed plants. So as the name vascular seed plants implies, they have vascular tissue that's specialized, so xylem, phloem, that sort of thing. And they also have seeds, unlike our vascular seedless plants, obviously. So defining characteristics of gymnosperms is that they have these naked seeds. Basically what that means is their seeds aren't enclosed in a fruit, in contrast to angiosperms, which we'll talk about in a hot second. So really common in gymnosperms are cones. So coniferous trees are gymnosperms, which coniferous trees are things like pine, spruce, fir, that sort of thing. So think of, a pine cone. That's what I mean by cones. They are basically clusters of sporophylls. And sporophylls are, how should I word that exactly? They're basically specialized leaves with sporangia on the surface. So essentially, they can serve a role in reproduction. I didn't think we would really have time to go too in depth with that, so I didn't think I would go deeper than that, but we are probably going to finish with a bit of time, so if people want, we can talk about that further. But anyway, basically what I would want to know about gymnosperms in terms of their defining characteristics, definitely the concept of naked seeds, so seeds that aren't enclosed in a fruit, and cones. And so there are 4 major groups of gymnosperms. I probably wouldn't worry about like memorizing the names of the 4 different groups. I don't even know them off the top of my head. Ginkgophyta, that's one. I just think that's so fun to say, the ginkgophytes. Anyway, and then the one that's probably most relevant for New Brunswick, well, it's definitely most relevant for New Brunswick, probably Atlantic Canada, probably Canada in general, most of North America. That could be a stretch. Definitely New Brunswick, though, is the conifers, so Coniferophyta. I think that's actually with an O. Whoops. Is this me not knowing how to spell it? No, that's words problem. So yeah, this Coniferophyta group consists of conifers. So yeah, I'm sure if you're a forestry student or an environmental management student, you probably know a lot more about conifers than I do. But essentially, New Brunswick's full of them. If you go to the woods anywhere in New Brunswick, there's a lot of conifers. If you've ever flown over New Brunswick and it's like a, not a super cloudy day, or even, I mean, if it is cloudy and you get below the cloud level, whatever, and you look out, it's like just this sea of conifer trees. Particularly if you've ever flown over New Brunswick in the winter when our leafy trees don't have their leaves, it's kind of ridiculous how many conifers we have. It's basically a sea of this, deep green color. It's kind of interesting. Anyway, New Brunswick is a carpet of conifers, essentially. So yeah, Coniferophyta group is super important to New Brunswick. Very important, I'm guessing, to a lot of, our forestry industry. So again, I don't think that's necessarily, relevant for a midterm or anything, but we did talk about it in the recordings, that New Brunswick is definitely dominated by conifers, and that they're one of the groups of gymnosperms. Okay, I feel like I've gone on and on and on about that, so I'll move on. Defining characteristics of angiosperms. So a big thing, there also are vascular seed plants, but instead of having naked seeds, they have seeds in fruits. And basically what the fruit provides, 2 main things. I've already given one away, but one is protection, and also can aid in dispersal, which I'll get into. So essentially, fruit protects the seed. I think that's quite obvious, because seeds are typically in the very middle of the fruit, and they are much less prone to being, lost, blown away, that sort of thing, dried out, waterlogged, really all of the above. And then dispersal is kind of an interesting one because essentially what happens is that animals eat fruit, obviously. So, you get a bear in the woods that eats an apple from an apple tree that's fallen. And then bears have pretty huge ranges. So the bear walks like 10 kilometers and then the bear takes a dump, and the bear has seeds in its feces, and then the seeds grow in this new area that's 10 kilometers away from where the fruit originated from. So not necessarily saying that every time a bear eats an apple, it's going to grow a new apple tree in the woods somewhere. Definitely not the case. There's lots of, different variables that play a role in that situation, but definitely a method for seeds to kind of get around a lot further than they could just get around through wind, for example. Although some seeds have developed very good mechanisms for getting around. I meant to mention previously I'm not even sure where I meant to mention this, but basically, again, this is tricky because typically we kind of talk about this, in-person class, since everyone's in the same room. We're all in New Brunswick. So people could be anywhere in the world right now watching this. But anyway, if you're familiar with maple trees and maple seeds, and a lot of them come in these little helicopters, people typically call them, and they kind of spin really quickly in the wind. And so the wind blows and the seeds kind of blow off of the tree, and they can go really far, actually. Kind of cool. My parents, when I was a baby, I think, planted a couple of Manitoba maples in our yard, and so they're not a native species. We have no Manitoba maples nearby our house, or we never did. But recently, in the last kind of couple of years, we've noticed Manitoba maple saplings popping up kind of in our backyard, in the forest around our house, and we think it's probably from seed dispersal from those two Manitoba maples that were brought in, like 20 years ago. So I think that's kind of interesting. I'm gonna have to get another sip of water, sorry. So yeah, maple trees are not angiosperms, though. That was just an aside. Anyway, so one defining characteristic of angiosperms is these seeds in fruits. So any plant that produces a fruit is an angiosperm. Additionally, this is kind of the big one, production of flowers. Any plant that produces a flower is an angiosperm. So that's a lot of different plants, flower. That's just an incredible, really, amount of diversity. There are so many different flowering plants. Yeah, an insane amount of diversity. So yeah, essentially any plant that can produce a flower is going to be an angiosperm. So it's a seed plant, it's vascular, it produces fruits. If it produces flowers, all of that information. And again, okay, we only have 7 minutes left, which probably really isn't that much time. I was thinking about kind of going over the anatomy of a flower, kind of the different reproductive pieces, because I think that's kind of interesting. And I do think it's kind of relevant, but I didn't think we would have enough time, which we probably really don't. I mean, we can do a crash course. Or if people want to see that, I can definitely make an effort to put it in next week for review, which, speaking of review, next week, midterm, final, whatever you prefer to call it, next Thursday. So I think probably what I'll do Sunday, we'll do the lectures that we're going over this week. And then Monday and Wednesday will both be review. Probably Monday will be review of the stuff that was covered on your first midterm, and Wednesday will be review of the stuff that has not been covered on a midterm, if that makes sense. That's not set in stone either. That's kind of just what I'm sort of toying with. So if you have any questions about tonight's content, let me know for sure right now. But if you have any questions about anything that we've talked about before your final midterm test, whatever, feel free to let me know. Send me an email, send me a message on Teams. I can set up another Google Forms if people prefer to have that anonymous option. I really appreciate feedback. It's good to know, because I guess it's just very odd, to be doing PAL virtually and not being able to read facial expressions and that sort of thing, and see where people are hung up on. But I pretty much guarantee if you're hung up on a particular concept, someone else is also hung up on that particular concept. So let me know if you have any questions. They don't have to be specific. You can just email me and be like, I'm confused about flowers. And I can make sure to include that in my call sessions. Okay. I'm gonna shut down the recording, but if there are any questions, let me know. I'll hang around.